AWA+D Symposium, Design is Political. Last Friday, we had a really great session and the focus was politics in action. Today, we're going to be talking about the politics in and of design. I'm Meg Coffey, president of AWA+D. Helping run today's events are other AWA+D board members, Vice President Sona Gevorkian, Parliamentarian Audrey Sato, CFO Tony Lewis, and Secretary Yolanda Lettieri. I'd also like to give a special shout out to our program's co-directors, Sarah Garina and Alejandro Ramirez. Thank you also to all the other directors, chairs, and volunteers who contributed to planning this year's symposium. There we go. Today's event is made possible as well by the generous support of our annual sponsors, ZGF Architecture, Atomic Irrigation, Louis Polson, Invisible Structures, and Juntang Photography. And our event sponsor this year is IOA Insurance Services. So now let's get political. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Annie Chu, principal of Chu and Gooding Architects. Annie is an architect, interior designer, and educator with 38 years of experience working on museums, educational institutions, and cultural and arts-related facilities. She graduated from SciArc and Columbia University, and in 1996 started a design practice with her husband and partner, Rick Gooding. Annie champions interior architecture as a distinct and emerging discipline and received the International Interior Design Association's Leadership Award Excellence from the Southern California chapter of IIDA in 2014. From 2017 to 2018, she served as a vice president on the IIDA International Board of Directors. Additionally, Annie is a dedicated design educator and was recognized with the Distinguished Presidential Honoree Educator Award by AIA Los Angeles in 2016. And that same year, she was inducted into the AIA College of Fellows. We will have a few minutes after her presentation for questions, so please be sure to write them in the chat. Also, I just want to make sure, are we recording, Alejandra? Okay, great. So welcome, Annie Chu.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Yes.
And what are you seeing on screen?
We see your whole presentation, so we see all the slides over on the left-hand side.
Okay, that's okay for now, I guess. I'll just, so how about that?
Great, that's
okay.
Perfect.
So I just want to thank everyone at AWA+D for this great opportunity. And I was joking around with Meg earlier that when I accepted this assignment, I thought, okay, I can do this. It's not exactly my subject matter, but once I dug into it, I just it was so daunting. So I want to give credit to Andrea Dietz, who's in DC, and she's been helping me with a lot of the research and able to kind of steer me. So, so I will start. Okay. One second. Okay. So I think we started, I want to start by sort of saying that as I went into this research for this keynote, I found that I have to define something for myself, some kind of baseline. And let's see if I can. You see the second slide, right? Can you see the second slide?
Yes.
Well, yeah, I just want to make sure it's going. So, um, one of the things that, that made it really clear to me was that, this one quote, which is space is a social product, a complex social construction based on values and the social production of meanings. And space in itself is, one of the things that you cannot, it's about relations, right? So politics is about relations too, and you can't have a relation without multiplicity, and space is in fact the kind of platform that allows multiplicity to happen. This is especially obvious what is political, and my presentation goes from what is obviously political to something that is not usually seen as political. So it's obvious in the US-Mexican border, like most borders, is established by violence, and its architecture is the architecture of violence. And this is a quote from Noam Chomsky. And in the reprint of the photo collage of the 60 miles section of the border that Studio Teddy Cruz did, the graphic design of the collage recreated the border and shedded light on the fear, the ugliness of racism, and the resulting uneven urban growth and advancement of the two countries. In the ever popular disciplinary machine, the panopticon, Jeremy Bentham thought all groups of society can be changed through constant surveillance. The prison guard can see every cell and inmate, but the inmates cannot see into the tower to figure out whether the guards are watching or not. So in fact, the inmates live under constant surveillance, whether it's real or imagined. And with the rise of AI, I think we can concur that all sorts of our own data are also constantly under surveillance, and we're in fact under watched by unknown watchers, who are also being watched by those who are keeping track of all our actions. The Vietnam War Memorial struck me as a prime example. It was an earlier prompt for rethinking monuments, and that's a hot topic right now. Its design challenged how and exactly what do we want to memorialize and how we process war. By confronting and embracing the human loss caused by the action of our ruling class. So it's profoundly confrontational and simultaneously intimate and universal. And the design also provoked a status quo of public art as well as memorials. The tilted arc. We also recognize that formal interruptions to the forms of capitalism is also political. The forms of capitalism themselves present at this Foley Federal Plaza, as the tilted arc was taken down, are just as political. And the forms of the capitalism on this plaza are the 4 classical colonnaded US courthouse with 4 other federal buildings, the New York County Courthouse, Manhattan Municipal Building, the Court of International Trade, and the Church of St. Andrew, the patron saint of singers, spinsters, maidens, fishmongers, fishermen, and women wanting to be mothers, gout, and sore throat. So you couldn't ask for a more complete array of the guardians of capitalism and patriarchy in one spot. So Sarah's 120-foot long, 12-foot high wall disrupted the workers' daily routine and forced the site to be an extension of the sculpture. And in that very twisted way, literally, advanced the concept of sculpture and impeded surveillance. Casa del Fascio, we start thinking about buildings that have that kind of political root, which is the local office of the National Fascist Party, established the state and image in Italy. This is the so-called stripped or starved classicism style. It was adapted by many totalitarian democratic regimes. And one wonders about this style, which was the de facto standard for government buildings all over the world between the 2 wars. And yet it was future facing, a paradox, at least because the so-called brutalist children of this style was attacked by Donald Trump's executive order, as you know, that future federal buildings must be built in the classical Greek, Roman, or similar style deemed beautiful. Joseph Paxton's original Crystal Palace was an emblem of the arrival of the British Empire on the world stage. Taking over previous world-dominating Greek and Roman empires, the building's design is a celebration of that identity. Symbols are extremely powerful, and 2 years after the Crystal Palace in England, without even bothering to change the name Crystal Palace, New York put up their own version to celebrate the industry of all nations, and of course, to mostly show off America's arrival as a world-class industrial leader. This is a fleeting propaganda machine of conspicuous consumption. And of course, planning of the cities will not be able to escape political baggage and contradiction. French-American military engineer laid out democratic egalitarian space, and based on the Freemasons' sacred geometry and symbolism for a city that is ironically constructed largely by slaves. At the dawn of the new millennium, Sex and the City's TV show star Carrie Bradshaw revealed that she only used her oven for sweater storage. And she seemed to herald a new era of femininity untethered to the kitchen-bound domesticity epitomized by other June Cleaver bygone stars of television who are depicted as housewives in high heels, keeping the house in order, having a martini and dinner ready when the man returns home from a day's work. The kitchen has long been a war zone in which the politics of shifting gender roles are fought over. Margaret Schütte-Wiholski was credited as the first professional female architect in Austria. She incorporated new ideas about cleanliness and productivity, and even though she never ran a household and had never cooked, she interviewed housewives in women's group and even conducted time motion studies to reveal how women navigate their kitchens. She regarded the kitchen as a workplace or laboratory, and 10,000 of her kitchens were reproduced. I can't imagine, and I can't think of anywhere in history where women were really like sincerely asked about, what their needs are in the home. With the advent of the modern kitchen in America came a dramatic shift in culinary expectation for women across class lines. The pre-war kitchens were the domain of servants, as you can see on that top left plan. The Frankfurt kitchen, which is on the bottom left, brought middle-class and wealthy women into the kitchen and making it a desirable place to be. It's labor commendable and totally visible instead of hidden. Promised pleasure from a refrigerator with a built-in ice maker, anything to make their labor easier. The 1940s and 50s saw happy housewives content to make life as comfortable as possible for their husband and children. But as their role in the kitchen became even more glamorized in popular culture, women's restrictive space within the walls of the kitchen bred a simmering resentment due to their unpaid labor and little prospect of professional opportunities for self-actualization. So the dissatisfaction with the promised good life of hearth and home bursted into the public discourse of course, the volume that we are all aware of, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963. And now the kitchen today for us is a stage of aestheticized experiences for both men and women, aspiring food-savvy savants who make time in the kitchen despite their busy work and home lives. Now the war zone space of the kitchen is again remade and reconsidered. This is a very early project when I was working for Frank Israel, and I thought I brought it up because it was an unusual circumstance. The house has been the standard model of heteropatriarchy and is a stage where generations of women were socially and spatially molded into the standards of the heterosexual woman. Architecture of the house is spoken through a highly gendered and heterosexualized, basically paternal-maternal idiom. Even the terminology of the house very obviously indicate patriarchal traditions. We still call it the master bedroom and the traditionally male library study where men acquire knowledge and occupation and the women mill around doing housework. The man has been the center of the family, and the wife, as Mabel Wilson and Heidi Ness wrote in Lawful Transgressions, the article about This is the House that Jackie Built, the wife assumes the burden of being the overseeing eye monitoring the house. And this is really important because with the nested systems of enclosed systems, from locks of the front door to the locks of some kind of box to share, save some treasure or whatever. Each of these layers of the house have a lock, and she enforced a rule of the household and keep the locks in place. So everything in its place become this kind of cry for basically the responsibility of the woman. So two things about homes come to mind. So this is a kind of conceptual drawing of the same space that you just saw. One is about program. So the design of this house puts the woman as the center of the house. The client is a woman, head of household with 2 children and a full-time career as a vascular surgeon, and her programmatic requirement to be able to observe as much of the goings on in the house from her vantage point. And this is what's going on. So in the space where she is, an office space guarding her bedroom suite, she surveys the Bay Bridges beyond through her window. She watches who comes in the house for the entry below and which child retreated to the bedrooms across, and a glance down to the dining room and conference room to check out all the ruckus below. Similarly, but very differently, another project from our office for a tri-generational family of which the mother, who temporarily suspended her career to raise 3 children, similarly requested a program of her office space, but in this case to be shared with her children. From the traffic control spot of the kitchen, she orchestrated the school day departure ritual of the kids. You can sort of see the toothbrush over there, including a tiny half bath by the entry door to catch the kid who failed to brush their teeth upstairs. The kitchen adjacent shared office space, which is in the middle of all those 3 dots there, and also the slightly more remote space at the 9 a.m. Mark there, becomes her domain until the kids return from school, when her surveillance duties continue again. Homework is done in the shared office space where computer screens can be monitored from various vantage points, and while she prepares snacks and dinner for them. The second thing about home is women's guilt. And I think that that's something that some of us who share quite a bit. So in Marie Kondo's Tidying Up TV series, women's guilt for failing to be the perfect homemaker feature incessantly in the series. The women always feel like it was theirs and only their responsibility to keep the house organized. The family members would say wonderful phrases about the woman along the lines of, it's so easier to have mom remember where everything is. In one episode, mom's struggling to keep her balance as parenting 2 children with working part-time and keeping the spark alive with the husband who works 60+ hours a week. And the argument with her husband is her refusal to do laundry, which she hates. So they have hired help. By the end of the episode, though, she decides to do laundry herself and try to enjoy it. There is no mention of how her husband is going to help her. The story arc is complete when the woman finally accepts her due task. Women are still fed that line that you can have it all, and that includes complete control over our homes so our family can enjoy mess-free living. If patriarchy does not spark joy, it's time to get rid of it too. Early attempts at mapping disease outbreaks failed due to bad assumptions and faulty science. But in 1854, John Snow mapped a London cholera outbreak and totally changed the public health profession's approach to epidemiology and contributed to a new era of urban growth and industry. On the same subject as the pandemic, the 2 divergent responses to flu in US Samoa offered as good a natural experiment as we are ever going to likely see when it comes to whole country quarantines during pandemics. America Samoa shut out the world and had 0 deaths, while at least 8,500 died in Western Samoa. It seems a fairly clear statistical endorsement of quarantine. The refinery, the largest on the East Coast here, on the Philadelphia Energy Solutions complex, dating back to the early days of the oil industry in the 19th century, was single-handedly responsible for more than half of the city's cancer-causing air toxins, according to a report from the city, and it contributed to 125 premature deaths that the American Thoracic Society and NYU says result from the air pollution in Philadelphia each year. The South Philadelphia area surrounding the facilities, where 60% of residents are Black, has some of the highest asthma hospitalization rates in the city, where asthma numbers top those in all but a few cities. In March of 1974, Gordon Margo Clark joined a bunch of artists, and they mounted an exhibition entitled Architecture, which is basically a merged term of anarchy and architecture. And they profess to be interested in exploring new ideas of form and space in the midst of urban decay. What we are now seeing in hindsight is that modernism, in fact, formed the larger horizon of this piece, splitting its meaning, rather than some kind of display of the collapse of the city and erosion of culture or anything like that. So in this, it has become almost obligatory to describe Margo Clark's work as a critique of modernist architecture and more generally modernist art. So all these terms that we use very freely now in academia and in design, such as intervention, interrogation, disruption, investigation, all came from, this work. Race, gender, class, and politics combine in insidious ways to engender an unequal citizenship status. A hierarchy of welfare and housing programs existed, and the ones that Black women and their families rely upon were generally at the bottom of the hierarchy. The government support the low-income Black women secured often came in the form of restrictive means and moral-tested public assistance program, which is the lowest tier of programs that evoke the most hostility. While the government subsidized mortgages for white people, Black people were more likely to benefit from the government's largesse in the form of conventional public housing rather than assistance for mortgages. As compared to hostile architecture that prevents loitering and NIMBYism, which we're all very well aware of in all the recent events around Silver Lake and everywhere. I wanted to bring this attention, and most of you should know already about the show that is ongoing till the end of the month. And should anyone be lucky enough to go, and if you have a phone on screen, the QR code, if you want to grab that one, it's a link to MoMA's site about reconstructions, that about 10 Black architects who came and revisited the space, the Black space in America. And if you haven't seen it, there was a interview with Mabel Wilson, who's one of the co-curators of the show in LA Times. And again, this QR code, if you're interested, point your phone on your screen and get that QR code. It's a really well worth reading article. I can't get into it because it's a short time that we're sharing together. A big nod to Sarah Lorenzen, who you're gonna hear, and Peter Togan for this project, XYY. It emblematizes the cultural issues at play in the so-called potty laws, as well as other historic civil rights laws, and that have sought to define how restrooms are designed and used. And restrooms are also political war zones. This is a not so obviously political one. This is, of course, Madonna in its many formulations. Queerness is relational, strange, and both anti-separatist and anti-assimilationist. It is an open mesh, though, of possibilities and gaps and overlaps and dissonances and resonances and excesses of meaning. In other words, it exists as a counterpoint and a reconfiguring agent, and it filters and reprograms and conditions all sorts of subjects. So in this regard, we're understanding it as a guide we can use to navigate the past and inflect our methods of design and practice today. Where pioneering work in queer space was mostly deeply embedded in identity politics, radical forms of breaking normative codes and spatial choreographies. Today, we might think more about where queerness might reshape the logic of the discipline and the fundamental design methodologies. If I were making quotes all along, you can see that the quotes were mentioned in the caption of the slide. And again, not so obviously political, Kurt Schwitters made these collages in the wake of the First World War as hopeful portraits of how deconstruction or destruction can feed creation, how bits of advertising and scraps of newspaper, wood, garbage, urban debris can also be collaged together into something new and beautiful. And one of the last two slides I want to show you is this, the vessel, the 16-story vessel viewpoint that was designed by Heatherwick Studio for Hudson Yards, which has been temporarily closed after a man reportedly committed suicide by jumping from it. It marks the third death by suicide at this 46-meter high structure since it opened in 2019. And this gives us a lot of pause and a lot of thought about the existence of this piece of architecture in the center of this highly capitalist space. And yeah, I don't know how to think about it, but maybe we can talk about it. And finally, I have to share this because I was watching some PowerPoint several years ago, and it was done by an AIA staffer who was no longer employed by the AIA after it happened, and it has the most derogatory statements about interior designers that one ever saw from the institution. But I just want you to be aware that the AIA, of whom I'm a member, holds a consistent stated opposition to interior design legislation. And you can read this. They don't recognize interior designers and the idea is that, health, safety, welfare for the public prevents them from kind of embracing it as a profession. But you have to think about the majority of interior designers are women. And so in fact, what the AIA's default doing is preventing the economic advancement and actualization of women. So, what they're doing every year, pumping, 6 figures or more into stopping professional licensure from happening from state to state for interior designers is in fact a pervasive negative attitude that makes it possible for all the their members and architects to continue to disrespect the activities and the profession of interior designers. And, essentially it's basically a turf war, but turf war at the expense of women. So I want everyone to be aware of that. And if you ever encounter any of this type of political injustice, please use your conscience and, support if you can. Thanks for the time. Sorry, it went longer.
Annie, that was amazing. And it was such a great follow-up to what we had last Friday of, trying to how we can leverage our positions as designers to change policy and to really think about how we affect the built environment. That was really great. Sona?
Yes, I agree. Thank you, Annie, for giving us a lot to think about. I think I'm speaking for all of us in saying that we're glad we recorded this because there's a lot to go back to. We are now switching to our conversations. I'm Sona Gevorkian, the Vice President of AWA+D. I'm here to introduce the first of our 3 one-on-one conversations on the topic of politics in design. The speakers for our first conversations are our facilitator, Lise Bornstein, AIA partner at KFA Architecture, also AWAF board president this year, Carol Lanham, AIA, Associate DBIA CCM, Civic Principal at Lionakis. She's also our Mentorship Director at AWA+D. And Mitra Mimari, AIA, Lead APBD plus C, and Partner at ZGF Architects. I will now ask our speakers to further introduce themselves and start the conversation.
Hi, I'm going to start us off and lead in with our speaker introductions. Hi, I'm Leif. Carol, could you please start us off and tell us about yourself?
Oh, sure. Hi, everybody. Good morning. And Annie, thank you for that. It was a wonderful presentation. You're going to be a hard act to follow for sure. Anyway, my name is Carol Lanham. I am an architect and a principal at Lionakis. I am the civic design lead for Southern California for the firm. Also director of mentorship for AWA+D. So I see many familiar faces. Also active in AIA, the Government Outreach Committee, and my background is doing a lot of municipal projects for local governments. I also spent a stint as the circuit architect for the federal court, and so I am very happy to be here and pleased to be invited. And so I'm just going to shoot it to my co-partner in this, Mitra. I think it's your turn.
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today. My name is Mitra Mimari. I'm a partner at ZGF Architects. I've been practicing architecture for about 30 years on a variety of project types, from healthcare to research laboratories to high performance commercial and mixed use developments. I love the variety that architecture provides. And I have to agree with Annie that, this is such an amazing topic, and just getting my head into how everything we really touch as designers is political, as the presentation we just saw beautifully expressed, is an awareness that was brought to me just kind of more pointedly through getting ready for this. I'll also share that I immigrated from Iran as a teenager to the United States. And I think that immigrant experience brings a lot with it, brings a lot of loss as well as opportunities. And that's shaped who I am today. Lastly, I will say that I am involved in AIA Los Angeles. I will be the president next year, and hope to make an impact in a small way that I may be able to do. But I really appreciated Annie to bringing awareness to something I wasn't aware of that AIA did, and trying to find out a little bit more. And that's part of these conversations in my mind, is that we all learn so much from each other. So to kick us off, I guess, Carol, I'll ask you, using public funds for a civic facility sometimes makes the project political. How do you navigate working with elected officials who promote a project and engaged community that may be against spending those tax dollars?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think Annie even touched on it when she talked about NIMBYism. And I think it doesn't sometimes really matter what the project is. You always will have people that oppose it, right? And so I think that the good side of having an engaged community is they're interested in what's going on in their community and they're taking a vested interest. But the con of that is that you're also going to get people who you are not going to be making happy, whatever you decide to do. So I think in the work that I do with municipalities, you're working with government officials who are spending tax dollars. You're working with communities who don't want their tax dollars to be spent on whatever. And the only way to kind of deal with that issue is to have conversations. And I think everybody's firm has outreach where they go into the community and you hold public meetings and you give everybody a chance to speak and listen to what they have to say. And so I think one of the things that I've learned, I think we all learn being in this industry, is that oftentimes listening is just as important as speaking, right? So you have to really listen to what people have to say and realize that sometimes they don't know what they're asking for. We understand space, we understand buildings and all that. And a lot of times people in the community don't know what they don't understand how to ask for what they're talking about, or they don't understand how to frame what they're afraid of. And so it's really listening to what people have to say and then trying to acknowledge, whether or not you agree with them or whatever, you've got to get that conversation started. And I think that that's how we proceed with doing that. So, it's always a difficult thing. So that leads me to a question for you, Mitra, which is that not only are you dealing with communities and dealing with, stakeholders and people who are doing the building, within any project, you've got multiple stakeholders who sometimes have different interests and sometimes have different forms of influence. And so how do you navigate? Sometimes people agree, sometimes they conflict. How do you deal with those situations within your practice?
Sure. A lot of the projects that I do touch are pretty big and complex and have a lot of people who are invested in the project. And I think what I always believe in is that you really need to navigate and understand the relationships from the onset. I always say that we're in the people business, meaning that it's all about the relationships in the end. Sometimes I think the design is the easy part and navigating those relationships is the hardest part. So I think understanding where everyone is coming from, why they're coming from, where, their positions has been really helpful to be able to navigate and understand how to articulate things to different individuals in a way that resonates with them. I think one thing as designers that I found really helps is bringing it back to the emotions, that emotional connection of not the architectural talk of why a building needs to be this way or that way, but what is the experience of those different individuals that are going to be walking through this space? What is the intent of how they feel? In a healthcare setting, you really want people to feel embraced, to feel well taken care of. And so talking about how our design does that is much more compelling than talking about colors or finishes or whatnot. So I think that that's always been helpful in resonating with people. And then there's going to be ultimate decision makers in any project. There's probably either a small group or one or two individuals. Really being able to push back, I think, is another way. Sometimes I find myself or others, being afraid, quote unquote, of clients. We don't want to lose our clients. We don't. And so whatever they say has to go. But I always think about dissecting what they say and really understanding what do they mean by what they say. And where is their real concerns versus the visible ones. So it's a lot of dialogue, but taking that responsibility as a designer to really look out for what's good for everybody.
So I'm going to actually pull from that a little bit and sort of reframe a little bit. So we all know that budgets are tricky. And so how do you work with internal user groups and public agencies to come up with a design that meets all of the wants and needs of community and everything, but also meets those very pragmatic things like budget? And
I can start.
Okay.
Obviously the budget is especially in public buildings, because of just the way the process works. a lot of times the budget is established by a group of people based on what's available, maybe not even what the need actually is, because not everybody was engaged in the process. And it may also be the case where the budget was established, 2 or 3 or 5 years previously. And so by the time a project actually comes to fruition, the budget may or may not meet may even not meet the original scope. And so when we start a project, my goal is to try and get as many stakeholders involved as possible. And again, we talk about that most agencies, most people that we deal with don't understand space and they don't understand design. They just know that they want a place to do their job. And so I think understanding sort of what they do and what is the process and how is that important to them, and then trying to translate that into a way to make it work is the best way. And I think in getting as many stakeholders as possible involved in the conversation, you at least hear what everybody has to say. You can ask the questions as to, nobody oftentimes don't care like what kind of HVAC system you're going to have, or are we using LEDs, or are we using fluorescents? Nobody cares about that. They care whether or not there's a glare on their computer screen or whether or not they're too hot or too cold. And so you just sort of have to understand where they're coming from, try and address all of their concerns, and also realize that most people get one shot usually to ask for the world, and realize that they can't get everything that they ask for. But at least if they understand the process and they are part of it and they understand how you came to the final solution, you'll get a lot more people that will buy into the final, whatever the final design is, because they understand how you got there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, similarly, Carol, I think the way I think I've seen it approached successfully, and the way I like to look at it is that at the onset of the project, it's really hard to limit ourselves with money, because I think we need to really understand everything. We need to put everything on the table and hear everybody out, and understand the whys. Why is this important? That's what I feel like the burden of an architect is, to get all of the whys and put them in an order and a priority that we really eventually get to the goal and of the institution that we're working with. So I think that's really critical. If that is done early in the project, and if the expectations are set that we want to talk about everything, but as adults, we know we don't get everything that we want. So how can we help prioritize what's most important to you throughout this process? And this is usually in the schematic design where, the dialogue is really open, the conversation is really open. And I always ask our clients to just give us a little bit of room. Like, don't get the CM in the room and say, we can't afford that, or we can't do this, because it's too early. We have plenty of time to get on budget. And I think we've all had to have budgets that we have to adhere to, but I don't want that to be the driver of the decisions that we make. I want what's the best for the institution and for the people who are going to be using it to be the driver, and we'll make the budget work. If we don't get those finishes that we really want, it's okay, as long as we get the heart of what's needed for the project. Carol, I think the last administration really had mandates that impacted architects, especially with the federal style of the public buildings. It's something that we all lived through. How do you navigate a client's picture of what they want versus what may be more cost-effective, sustainable, energy efficient? And do you think it's possible to decide when to break the rules and when to follow them?
So I think that it's one of the biggest issues, and speaking of the federal style of architects working for the federal court, I will say that judges are very opinionated. Obviously, if anybody's met a judge, you know that. And they also are very clear about what they want. And they want like the building to look like a courthouse. And it's kind of like, and they have in their head, they have an idea of what that looks like. And so that classic style to them is the picture that conveys the importance of the building. And so I think with all of that, you kind of have to just, again, it's understanding their point of view and how that is an impact. One of the things that I had the worst issue with in dealing with the federal court was the judges always wanted their carpet in their offices to be green, like that banker green, because to them that was like the Harvard Law School library green, or they wanted it to be red. So it looked like the Supreme Court. If you ever look at pictures of the Supreme Court and where they sit, their carpet is red, and it works great in their space, maybe, but if you imagine it in somebody's, 15 by 20 office, it's a horrible color. And what do you do with that? And so you really have to just sort of like understand the feelings behind, and you have to be, I don't know, people who you're talking to are not architects and they're not designers, but they still have the wants and the needs. So you as a designer have to sort of interpret the architecture for them and try and come up with a way of getting to something that speaks to them. Just like, as you said, Mitra, get to the heart of what they're asking for. And I think that's the, are there rules? Are this, there's obviously building codes and there are rules that you cannot break, but there are some things that you have to, just try and speak to the picture in their head and give people pictures to react to and try and understand, just understand what it is that they're really looking for, and hope that what you provided is something that they're going to be happy with, I think. And along with that, I'm going to say that this is something that we've also had to deal with. So a question for you is sustainable design, and making projects more sustainable is often not the top priority with clients because they don't really understand it. Although I think people know that climate change is an issue, but they don't know how does that relate to sustainable design and health and well-being and all of that stuff. And so how do you bring that topic to projects when you're working with clients, because it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. In the day and age that we live in, with the fires we have and climate change just constantly being an issue for all of us. I think as ZGF, kind of sustainability has been in the DNA of like all of the work we did. I remember we worked on the first LEED project for USC back in 2008. And we really, and this is something that we had to do in those years for a lot of different institutions, where we really had to share with them what does LEED mean and what does sustainability mean. And I think that one of the biggest factors that really helped drive reasoning for them to pursue it was the long-term benefit of reducing energy because it reduces cost. I think one of the short-sightedness of a lot of our project is that there's this finite budget that we all have to adhere to. And we don't think, and so it's hard for the people who are going to be are in charge of the project to think about what about in 10 years and 20 years? How does spending a little bit more now, being more energy efficient, being more better for the environment, will actually save you money in the long run. I think since then, really, we don't even talk about LEED anymore. I mean, we just do it, honestly. I think that there's certain clients that really push for it, but otherwise we do all the right things that we need to do in order to make it happen. I think for us, it's not a question. It's like a must. And I'll just add another thing, California, if you guys don't know, AIA California, AALA, I think a lot of other organizations are really pushing for a zero code adaptation in California. I think that's, as talking about politics, policy is one of the biggest ways that we can all impact change that's really critical. So there's a lot of conversations taking place with that. One of the things that this code wants to do is to have new commercial buildings be 100% electrified. So no gas going into any building. And so there's a lot of resistance with that going on in different jurisdictions. But this is one way I think that as designers, we can really be involved and take action.
And I'm gonna add, I'm just gonna push that. I think you will have the ability to do this next year as president of AIALA. I think that if the AIA or somebody could put together a presentation to take to municipalities to explain what this code means to them, so that it isn't this scary thing and everybody thinks it's going to be all this money. I think that would be a good initiative on for AIA to take up, because I think that education about what it means is something that will help alleviate some of those fears.
You're absolutely right. And I think we started that on the legislative day that we have at AIALA last year. We met with the mayor and all of the council members throughout the city and did exactly that, Carol. But that continues. It's not, it's a continued work.
Of course. It's always a conversation.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to jump in here. I know we have had, this is a great conversation on, especially on the sustainability of politics. And I think we're going to see that impact for many years to come. I am going to turn the virtual microphone over to Meg, because we have some questions for you both.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thanks, Lise. So we just have maybe like 2 minutes max. So if you'll respond briefly to this. We had one question in the chat, which was, have you attempted specific moves in your work to subvert patriarchal assumptions?
God, that's a hard question. So in the work, wow, I don't even know. I think as so being a woman in this whole thing, I think it comes naturally in that listening to both men and women speak about the spaces that they need and making sure that everybody has an equal voice is sort of the only way to kind of, I guess, subvert. I sometimes don't think the patriarchy is as overt or intentional as just unconscious. And so it's sort of just recognizing those issues and trying to deal with them in a diplomatic way as much as possible.
I deal with it every day. I'm aware of it every day, and I try to push back on it every day. And it is a lot of work because we continue to be a white man dominant profession. But, a colleague of mine says this as well. We're also in spaces mostly that have been designed by white men. So I think it comes in many different ways at us. And I would just say, with the social justice movement last year, I think the awareness is high on many levels. I would just say keep that pressure on and take the actions that each of us can take on our own.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you all so much. Lise, do you have any concluding statements for that conversation?
I don't. I'm already blown away, and it's, we're only into the first and second presentation, so I'm good.
Thank you. Thank you all. Appreciate
Thank you.
What a rich morning so far. Thank you so much, Mitra and Carol. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, So for our second conversation, I have the pleasure of introducing Monique Lopez, founder of Pueblo Planning, and Irma Ramirez, professor of architecture at Cal Poly Pomona. Both are involved in community-based participatory planning projects that focus on social and environmental justice, certainly projects with significant relevance in today's politics. Welcome, Monique and Irma.
And similar to our first conversation, I would like to ask Monique to start us off with telling us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting us to this space today. Been really intrigued and by the conversations that have been taking place so far. I'm glad that this space is holding time for those types of conversations. So I'm both the founder and a social justice planner at Pueblo Planning, which is a participatory planning and design firm. Our intentional focus really is to engage community members who will be most impacted by any kind of planning or design decision. And typically these include community members who are Black, Indigenous, non-Black people of color, folks with low wealth, the unhoused LGBTQ community, folks with various abilities, and really focusing on those individuals and elevating their voices in both planning and design. With that work, part of the intentionality is because we truly believe that design and planning is political, and who you're centering at those tables matters, and essentially ultimately dictates the types of solutions that move forward. With our work, we really try to seek out ways in which we center community members as experts and provide tools to do that, and see ourselves mainly as facilitators in that process. The tools that we use primarily are art making and storytelling, so that folks don't feel that they have to come into a discussion understanding the vernacular of planning. Art making as well in the process to share their own lived experiences and also their vision for what kind of future that they'd like to create. So I'll stop there. That's just a little bit of a teaser on some of the work that we're doing at Pueblo Planning. And yeah, I'll turn it back to Irma.
Thank you. I think, Liz, I don't know if you wanted me to just.
I absolutely, yes. Please tell us about yourself and everything you do.
Okay. Yes, I echo the sentiment. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very thrilled that this topic is getting attention and something that people want to hear about. And so I am a professor of architecture at Cal Poly Pomona, and I have a master's of architecture and a master's in urban planning. And I mentioned that because it is truly something that encompasses why I do the type of work that I do, that it really is something that helps us to, I think, expand outside of ourselves. A lot of the work that I do is teaching studios that take students outside of our bubbles and into environments that really highly discomfort them in very positive ways. And so I actually wanted to show just a couple of slides to, not so much to talk in detail about projects, but just to talk about some of the ideas that I think bring us here today. So I'm just gonna share my screen here. Let's see. And no, I think I can't see my notes if I share. I think I might leave the screen like this just because otherwise I can't see my notes. But in any case, we actually had started this discussion as we were preparing to talk about issues of community engagement with the question of what is what is design politics? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to each of us? And I think that there's a lot of premises that can be spoken about more on the mainstream, but I really think that design politics is something that is very personal, and it is very much part of the work that I do. So the first word that came to mind when I was asked the question of what does design politics means to you is I actually thought that it's uncomfortable, that design politics is an uncomfortable concept. Why? Because again, it is personal. I think it really asks us to, it requires us to step outside of the sphere in which we normally navigate, and it often attracts critique. Why? Because it is something that advocates for the whole, which is the people, instead of the one, which is the individual. And that I think is something that has been an ongoing challenge for the profession in general. We went on to, as Monique and I were preparing for this, we went on to say, well, why don't we show some images that have really inspired us in some ways. And I think, you know, for me, the expressions that have always been inspiring have been those that come from self-help expressions of community, where I think that there is a lot to learn. So here we have on the left an image of the Tijuana settlements in just across the border, where we see expressions of people that, you know, really it's self-help expression of home, not just shelter, but also home. And also the expressions of people in China with the nail houses that refuse to give in to developers. And so to me, these are very powerful statements of how people express themselves. And I feel that there is a lot to learn from that. So a theme, and maybe something that can turn into a question of discussion, is how we basically humanize the profession, how we humanize architecture and the design professions. And I think it really is a way to move forward into a profession, personally for me, that I have seen be really kind of an elite profession that makes me ask the question of, you know, who we are serving, you know, that oftentimes the client is not necessarily the person that is going to benefit from these projects. And so with the topic of politics and the topics that we choose to teach in the design studio, you know, I think, you know, for me, going across the border to Tijuana has been one of the biggest political statements, and at times, you know, very popular, and at times very unpopular. And I think some of our colleagues have been touching on this on these issues this morning. Certainly within the arena that we navigate these days with the issues of the border, it has become you know, even harder to do some of this work. It makes us question and what is the image that architecture is accepted to be, right? And it has put some of the projects that we've done in Tijuana with students, gives us the opportunity to talk about the aesthetics of architecture and who ratifies, basically, who is the architectural critic, what is the architecture that is accepted, right, to be called architecture. It's been one of the challenges for projects for doing community engagement in disadvantaged communities, right? Once you start, you know, giving a voice to groups of people that are highly politicized, you know, you have to respond to a lot of, we have to develop a thick skin rather to the critics. Annie Chu spoke about earlier meaning in architecture, and I think that engaging the community is something that really touches on how we gain meaning in the projects. And it really is by, of course, involving the citizens and by dialoguing with the citizens and really being able to decentralize ourselves from the work and develop a listening ear. Carol and Mitra were discussing, right? Listening very carefully to clients. And I think, this is something that obviously comes from community engagement to be able to do that. Now, for the projects that I work with, where I try to really seek to try to discomfort students as much as possible, again, because that is, I think, the only way to really learn. We have the projects in Tijuana, but we also have projects that we have done in China, where we take students on study abroad programs to do community-based urban design schemes. And so with the idea of listening, which I think is very important to develop in general, I think, these environments have actually provided an additional communication challenge, which is that of the language barriers. Certainly cultural and language barriers have actually really proven to be of incredible value, because suddenly in these classrooms, in these transnational interdisciplinary classrooms, the students are suddenly stripped of the only language that they know, that they learn in their classrooms. And it really has forced them to really bring down communication to a very human level, where you really got to get creative to understand people. And we've had actually incredible results. Of course, we have partners and we have help in the local settings that we go to. But for the most part, it actually has helped us to reach a much greater level of engagement and human value and meaning by having to bring ourselves really down to basics. So trust is, something that takes time, and I think is probably one of the biggest challenges of community engagement, because since it takes time to engage and to listen and to develop ideas, it's something that, we're not usually really ready to invest in, right? It takes time to earn trust, to work with communities and not come in from a perspective where we're coming in as experts to impart our wisdom. We really kind of have to take a step back. And I know Monique has spoken to me a lot about those ideas. So I will stop I will stop here, just, sort of questioning ourselves, to really kind of push ourselves to expand outside of our circles. And I'm just trying to find the stop share button. Thank you.
To stop. And I actually have a segue into, because I think that's a great segue to move into a lot of the work, Monique, that you've been doing. And so some of the notes that I took when we had our pre-meeting were both you and Irma both talked about humanization. Humanization and humans are just like core of what you both do and really kind of what makes you tick. And so I'm going to ask a loaded question, and I wrote it down as we were talking. Hold on. We're talking about humanizing spaces, and I know you do a lot of work in planning. So I'm going to ask, how is the act of planning political, and at all different scales and levels of engagement?
Yeah, thank you for that loaded question. I don't take my questions or potatoes any other way. So, so with that, if planning is political because it impacts our body, design is political because it impacts our body and our relationships with one another as well. And the act of breathing is political. What kind of air you are breathing is determined essentially by a set of activities that are associated with decision making that took place with or without your consent, right? And that's really what politics is. It's a set of activities that are associated with decision making, and that ultimately, and those processes that are set up. Also, when you peel away the process, you're able to see who holds power and who doesn't hold power or has very limited power in that. And so in the work that we do, we seek to disrupt how decision-making is typically made, how the politics are typically moved forward. And in that disruption, we seek to center those who are ultimately going to be impacted by those decisions. And I'm gonna show you some images in some of the ways in which we do that at Pueblo Planning. So I'm going to share with you one particular project we did with street vendors in Los Angeles and MacArthur Park. Street vendors were being displaced from the MacArthur Park area because what was being said is that they were in the way of pedestrian traffic. The instrument that was used to displace them was policing, where they were forcibly removed, or ticketed, or what have you. So we came in to work with a group of street vendors to redesign the plaza space and also the sidewalk space, so that they are truly not in the way of pedestrians, but that they could also coexist along with pedestrians as well. And I want to point out this particular image here. And one of the things that I often ask students of mine, I teach at a few different places, including Cal Poly in the Regenerative Studies program. I put this picture up and I ask students, who is the planner at this table? And the answer is that they're all the planner at the table. And when you recreate the table, where it centers the expertise of the community, what you've done is you've disrupted the power dynamics in that particular politics in that space as well. What's not enough to have people be the center at that table, so to speak, but that table that you saw quite literally was a picnic bench at MacArthur Park. So it's not enough to say we need to bring people to the table, but you need to go to their table, right? Quite literally. And when you do that, you start to disrupt, again, these power dynamics as well. What they were able to do is then take that design that they co-developed and quite literally take it to their city council member and use that in advocacy to move their proposal forward. You know, there's this very old notion, and this is what Idma and I were talking about, and at least when we're talking about before the session, there's this old notion in planning around this concept of what was coined rational planning in the 1950s. That the planner is this technical expert that is supposed to give their own technical expert advice for recommendations to move forward. And that's supposed to be an apolitical position. However, because the recommendations that are being provided ultimately impact people, whether in terms of harm or in terms of healing, a planner is not an apolitical technocratic being. A planner is a political actor. And so we do understand our positionality in terms of our role in a very political process, and that we cannot see ourselves as these technocratic apolitical beings, but essentially anything from the process to the recommendations that we move forward to our clients, which sometimes are public agencies that are tied to traditional political processes. We have to understand the political implications of that, and did we do our part to disrupt traditional segments of power in how we engage in the planning process, and understand that every single recommendation that, in our case, we try to move forward based upon what the community has directly shared with us, is an act of politics. It is a political act. It is a political stake in which you are making as well.
That's a big thing. And I know we're kind of getting to the end of time, but I wanted to ask this question of both of you. Irma, I'd like to start with you on this, because this came up in our conversations, and it's about teaching. And I think both of you are teachers, not only in your professional lives, but just in who you are. And so how do we then teach the next generation of architects, designers, planners, to have that collaboration, that the vocabulary, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, I do agree. I mean, actually we were, when we were preparing, we were talking about just the I think Monique mentioned that even just teaching as by itself, it's an act, it's a political act. And I think for me, the really the biggest thing to understand for myself is that influencing others is really key. And last week at the symposium, Hilda Solis was talking about mentors who inspire us and those who actually dissuade us. And I think we can all probably recount instances where we had both types of mentors. I found myself seeking a degree in planning concurrently with architecture because I wasn't finding myself, I just wasn't finding my happy place entirely addressed in architecture at the time when I was a student. And I had thesis advisors tell me that we are architects and not social workers. And so, when you get those moments, and I know Hilda Solis, I really love how she just kept talking about overcoming those frustrations and those aggressions. And so I think really we have to teach from the heart and find really our own personal invested love for community engagement. And so I think for me that is, when I teach my students in my generation is basically showing, to really look within yourself. Everybody has the thing that drives them. I'm an immigrant. I grew up with the immigrant experience, in which I feel that we have to do a lot for ourselves. And given by just looking again at the self-help methodologies of many of the communities that I work with. And so teaching, I think the next generation, which I actually think that they're in a much better space than I was when I was a student, and certainly through my work, I think that we are in a much better, much more welcoming environment. They already, I think, are in a much more politically minded and maybe socially minded stage. We just have to provide the opportunities of getting the students out of the classroom. I'll pass it on to Monique.
Yeah, thank you, Idema. A lot of what you were saying really resonated with me, and certainly elements that I integrate into the classroom as well. I teach at several different universities, and but before I get into that, I have a 2.5-year-old, and when I think about teaching, I have a child who has a mind of their own, which I'm really proud of, but also as a parent, like sometimes like frustrated with, right? So my kid is the adult I want them to be, but not necessarily at bedtime the child I want them to be, right? And for me, teaching, what I have found to be most effective for both my 2.5-year-old in my own life and then also in the classroom is to teach by modeling behavior, to teach by including lessons in terms of methods or methodologies that we want our students to do as practitioners. And what I mean by that is that my assignments aren't always the traditional assignment of write an essay about X, Y, and Z, but it's a different method to the meaning making that you're learning in the classroom as well. And the reason for that is because I want them to be comfortable and exposed to different ways to make meaning making, so that when they are practitioners out in the field, that they are comfortable in engaging people in ways that maybe are outside of traditional ways of engaging people. Also, when they communicate back to their client, sure, they could have the report, but are they allowing spaces for community members to share in their own words and in their own ways outside of just a written report? So is there spaces for art that can move both, policies and people, right, ultimately? So that's one of the things I do in the classroom as well. And then the other thing as well that I try to be really mindful of is in making sure and incorporating readings of both academics and practitioners that are Black, Indigenous, and non-Black people of color. And legitimizing those voices in academic spaces is incredibly important to bring in those perspectives, and also to bring in new frameworks and new and opportunities to expand our collective imagination of what is possible. One of the things that I try to integrate in both my practice and in the classroom is the ethos of what we need in order to move towards a more socially just community and world, essentially, is great creativity and great compassion. And so how do we integrate both into the classroom space, but even in our relationships with students as well? You know, provide having open conversations and dialogue if people do need more time for what have you, meeting people in the classroom where they're at, in the same way we meet people where they're at on the street. And so those are some things I try to model within the classroom, that I hope people take these particular experiences that they had in the classroom out with them as they practice the things as practitioners, right? That they learned in the classroom space as well.
Thank you both for, I think, bringing up the uncomfortable, the friction, the inspiration, and sort of the idea of all of these different points of view in our communities and in our profession. So I would like to thank you both for a wonderful conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you all for that insightful and thought-provoking discussion. My name is Yolanda Lettieri, Secretary of AWA+D, and I have the great pleasure of announcing that we will be now moving into a short break. So go grab another coffee or tea, and we will reconvene in about 5 minutes. During the break, we will be sharing a slideshow of our organization's history. 2022 will be our 100th year anniversary, and there is a diligent and dedicated committee working on events to mark the occasion. We hope you will be able to join us in these celebrations. Following our break will be the presentation of the AWAF Scholarship Awards. So see you here for that at around 11 a.m. Thank you.
You can make a donation at any time. Information on making donations is available on our website, which we'll post in the chat. I think Jan is going to be doing that. And please consider us also when you're planning your estate. Peggy Bowman's generous bequest has funded 7 scholarships over the years. We are also looking to expand our connections with firms and local organizations. So if you would like to continue with us, please email me, which is also posted in the chat. Right now, I would like to kick off our second of our awards events this year, and our 6th Fellowship Award event. In 2014 and again in 2016, we were fortunate to win 2 Southern California Development Forum Charity Awards, which started our fellowship program. As an organization, we had long wanted a way to celebrate and support professional mid-career women in architecture and allied fields in their research and exploration of design. Over 6 years of this program, we have had tremendously strong, talented winners with a wide variety of topics that have delved into our environment, mental health, and professional legacy. Reaching this point takes a lot of effort from many people over much of the year. In addition to our board, I want to give a shout out to the awards committee for all of their hard work. Co-chairs Jana Weby and Isa Metia, Weena Dowes, Pema Wangzum, Clarissa Chung, and special thanks to John V. Kanani, who selects, organizes, and hosts our fellowship jury. Today, we will welcome our newest fellowship recipient and listen to our 2020 fellowship winner's presentation of her work, followed by a Q&A session. And now to John V.
Good morning, everybody. I just want to thank everybody for being here today. So over the last 6 years, we've benefited from incredible jurors representing different facets and viewpoints in design, education, and policy, and this year is no different. Our jurors this year were Amanda Salu, Melissa Guerrero, Masako Ikagami, and Shruti Shankar. Amanda Salu is a director of operations at Givning Architecture. As Givning's Director of Operations, she's responsible for firm's business operations, focusing on strategic growth and financial stability. Melissa Guerrero is the Design Director of Konaki Design Initiative. With her degree in landscape architecture, she has worked with City of Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti's office to elevate the LA River in environmental policies and projects at the local, state, and federal level. Masako is a graduate of the Harvard University Graduate School of Design with a focus in landscape architecture. She currently works as a business developer with SWA Group. Shruti Shankar is an urban planner with Studio 111 and excels in visioning, strategic planning, transit-oriented development, streetscape and placemaking, master planning, and community engagement. I thank all our jurors for participating this year and selecting our winner, the fellowship recipient for this year. So this year's jurors came together and unanimously selected root forms among us by this year's AWAF Fellowship Award recipient, Anna Neymark. Anna is a faculty at SciArc and a co-principal of the first office in Los Angeles, California. The firm's work and writing received numerous honors, including the Architectural League Prize, the Architects Newspaper Best of Young Architects, and the nomination as a finalist in the MoMA PS1 Young Architects program. In her proposed project, she plans to publish the dolmen research and house planning presented in the exhibition Root Forms Among Us that was on display at the SciArc Gallery in 2020. It will be a publication with transformative approach to core questions in the field of architecture, colliding the worlds of megalithic stone formations with current fabrication techniques. This catalog will present original writing, archival photography, and architectural drawings. Our jurors appreciated how the inspiration of this prehistoric structure has evolved in Anna Neymark's work over time, and how something so monumental and sacred could inspire something practical like ADU plans pre-approved by LA City Department of Building and Safety. We and the jurors are excited to see how Anna's hard work comes to realization and inspiration to all. Since we are virtual, Anna, could you please wave to everybody so they can see you?
Hello to everybody. Thank you so much, Janvi, and thank you to the AWF and all the presentations this morning. It was beautiful.
And if you want to unmute and for a round of applause for Anna. Congratulations, Anna. With that, I will hand over to Jana, who's going to introduce Ashley Margo, our past year's fellowship recipient.
Thank you, Janvi. So Ashley Margo was our recipient last year, and she is a multimedia designer and art director with a background in architecture, design, print and graphic communication, art history, and urban and regional planning. As a graphic design teaching artist at Inner City Arts, Ashley leads classes for middle and high schoolers, collaborates with young artists and designers through the Work of Art program, and designs graphics for the organization. Ashley won last year's fellowship with her project proposal called Los Angeles by Color, which promotes wider access to the city's architectural history through an emotive approach to exploration and representation. Color is used as the catalyst to explore spaces in Los Angeles on foot that beckon but are lost while driving. A series of intentional urban explorations in LA examined over 100 places that vary in historical significance, functional typology, and span LA's boundaries. Viewed collectively, these pieces represent a new spatial understanding that reinforces the history of LA's urban environment. So I know we're all very much looking forward to this presentation. Ashley, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jana. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Is it working? Can everyone see my presentation? Okay, great. Thank you. So good morning. I'd first and foremost like to start out, oops, it is going through the presentation, so that's not correct. Okay. So I'd just like to start out by thanking AWAF for your support and interest in seeing where Los Angeles by Color would go, and for the opportunity to present this project for the first time publicly. I'd like to thank Jana for her guidance this past year, Andrea and Phyllis for imagining that this project could be something before it was, Lise, Sam, Maggie, Julia, Garrett, Mary, Christina, Sarah, and Miranda for talking through everything from the big picture down to the small details. So we'll be spending our next bit of time together looking at some of the built environment in Los Angeles, the city that I and many of you are in, but also now, because of our virtually shared space, one that many of you are not. The brief history of Los Angeles boasts prototypical freeways, a decentralized urban network, sprawl, high-density housing, a lack of major geographical markers. Historically, freeways have been seen as a means of understanding the city and location, a universal identification of LA that does not require time spent in it. Kevin Lynch's subjects describe the city as spread out, spacious, formless, without centers, something hard to envision or conceptualize. With time spent in LA, we've all constructed our own realities, versions, and identifiers with the place. Our movement in town, often dictated by work, family, and social obligations. And while for the majority of us, our movement was drastically altered over this past year, my time spent on Los Angeles by Color reflects on movement prior to 2020. Color. An appreciation of color dates back to primitive mankind and continues to impact contemporary work. Color is the connective tissue of the works of artist Amanda Williams, Vincent Lamroux, and explorations of international monochrome by Phaidon Press. My own interest in color dates back to kindergarten. Color can be the primary reason for a journey to a destination, often with the motivation of capturing oneself with the single-hued space in the background. Most notably seen in LA at the exterior pink wall of the Paul Smith store, one of the most visited tourist spots in the city. This otherwise unremarkable wall requires security guards to ensure that unauthorized professional cameras are not used at the location. In 2015, Vincent Lamroux coated the abandoned Bates Motel and surrounding vegetation in lime for the ephemeral public art intervention projection. This material was meant to erode and fade with time. It instantly drew crowds, but as the line faded, so too have the spectators. Are these locations' materiality of color more significant than other moments and spaces in LA? After almost a decade in Los Angeles, I was thinking about how surprisingly I had only ever driven by the Pacific Design Center, and less surprisingly, only driven by the Church of Scientology on Sunset Boulevard. I'd never ventured up to these buildings on foot. They didn't fall into any of my usual go-to spaces for work, errands, or fun. What reason did I have to go to these spaces? Besides the scale of these buildings, I was very visually drawn to them while driving because of the color. Could color be used as an excuse to visit what is out of the way of the everyday? So I decided, yes, color could be used as an excuse to visit what is out of the way of the everyday. So in 2016, I sent out an email to a group of friends inviting them to choose from a list of colors if they were interested in spending a day together based on that color. They just needed to show up at the start time and location. The rest of the day would be a surprise. I didn't know at the time what these tours would look like, but it seemed like a fun way to discover something new. I invite each of you to select one of the following colors: black, white, silver, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, pink, purple, tan, brown, or multi. You're welcome to share your selection in the chat with the group or to keep it to yourself. So today we will see where orange, yellow, green, and blue led to in Los Angeles. With guidelines in mind, I designed the tours through a combination of personal knowledge about LA and research. In order for a building or piece of infrastructure to qualify as one of the 5 to 8 stops on a tour, the primary color of the facade needed to be the color of the tour. Orange tour, orange building. Yellow tour, yellow building. A few exceptions were made. There could be a tie into the color through a cultural reference or the name of the place. For example, the Black Cat's exterior is painted white, but it was on the Black tour. Buildings could range from the ordinary to the unusual to the renowned. There needed to be at least one food stop per tour where the building's exterior also related to the color. But if that was not possible based on where we were in the city when it was a good time to eat, then the color of the food relating to the tour would suffice. For white, we had dumplings. I wanted to include a variety of functional typologies, but noting that this would be most evident when looking at the tours holistically and not individually. I also wanted to include buildings that were built in a range of decades where the intention of this too would be most evident when looking at the tours holistically. Each of these tours was designed for a specific person or people. It was important to have new experiences of LA. These new experiences also included the route. How could we drive down roads we might not otherwise, go to neighborhoods that we've not been to or don't frequent often? How would the route contribute to the element of surprise for those on the tour with me? The exact routes were predetermined directions. Going back to the color that you selected and with the guidelines in mind, what buildings or spaces in LA or the city that you're in pop into your head? I invite you to put and share that in the chat as well. So these graphic markers are going to start to show up in the presentation, and I just wanted to call them out since we're not in a physical space where you'd be able to have a key or that kind of detailed information easily available. So when you see a solid circle, that means that the entire building was that color. A donut looking circle means that only a portion of the building visited was that color. A dotted line for a circle means that due to varying circumstances during the day in the tour, we didn't make it to that space. And finally, a dotted circle with an X represents places where upon arrival, they'd either been demolished or they'd been painted over and they weren't the expected color of what the tour was going to be. So each exploration began with a single card that included directions to inform the next move. Route and the element of surprise, again, were of central importance, linking the exploration to a game. Here, game is not linked to competition nor separation from everyday life. It's about enjoying, playing, and experiencing the city, to have fun with what is the everyday, and to encourage others to engage with LA in ordinary but new ways. Guy Debord writes of the Situationists International that in a derive, one or more persons during a certain period drop their usual motives for movement and action, their relations, their work, and leisure activities, and let themselves be drawn by the attraction of the terrain and the encounters they find there. How can we continue to get lost in LA to continue to discover the seemingly familiar? I took photos at each stop, but there was no agenda to capturing specifics of buildings and moments, the only intention being that photo taking did not detract from time spent in spaces. I didn't know where or how these photos would be used, just that I might want them for future documentation and exploration. Maps. So representation of Los Angeles by map serves a variety of needs and caters to many audiences. Apart from traditional navigation, maps can show historic spatial relationships, popular tourist sightseeing spots, nodes that occur because of many people's planted vegetation, nodes that exist because of one individual, and a recognition based on experienced moments. All of these spatial understandings of LA bring scale and unique meaning to the spread out, spacious, formless city. These orange, yellow, green, and blue spaces all existed in Los Angeles at the same time, but for the day they became their own version of the city, a recoding and remixing. Revisiting, constructing, and playing with the images from the exploration began in 2020. With time, space, and daily interactions for everyone in Los Angeles transformed, I sat with the images. I imagined driving around the city surrounded by just these buildings, a drive where none of the buildings fade into the background. It's the LA that I know and wanted to wrap myself in while I was experiencing the city in an entirely new and challenging way of interaction. Ed Ruscha's Every Building on Sunset Strip reveals a stretch of the city connected as it was. My color ribbons weave together parts of the city that will never physically be connected, but that do exist as a spatial embodiment of knowledge and identity about LA. A longtime resident of the city, Sarah Gonzalez, noted on the Orange Tour that she discovered buildings she had never noticed before, but were always in plain sight, and how, quote, LA is a city notorious for neighborhood pockets, each with its own specific personalities and residents. It was nice to break away from those stereotypes and explore new areas with old stories and history, all while staying within the city limits of Los Angeles, end quote. Also noted Sarah was very good at pointing out orange spots that were between tour stops. With Miranda Romer visiting from New York and reference points limited, it was a perfect opportunity to cover a lot of space and neighborhoods in the city. This is an excerpt from Miranda's reflection. She noted that, I think it certainly made me reflect on the cultural makeup of the city and the social political context of the sites in relation to the local demographic. I appreciate how the color yellow for these sites seemed to be very carefully picked. Yellow on this tour was a metaphor for optimism, protection, and even a symbol of Los Angeles itself. The 5 sites we visited that day had such great correlations. 2 establishments were restaurants, and each felt very genuine to the LA experience. One was a local Korean restaurant that very much represented the neighborhood roots. The latter, a once mom and pop business turned conglomerate and the very symbol of Americana. 3 other sites, the New Carver Apartments, Amino South LA High School, and Golden State Mutual, had an interesting shared past in that the very purpose of their existence aimed to serve the marginalized communities they were in. But, we didn't make it to the last 2 stops because of a lively detour at an oversized vintage shop, where their owner enthusiastically told us about his famous shoe collection. Luckily, we made it to the Golden Arches as we visited them on 3 continents, and this seemed to be an important one for us not to miss together. Green was experienced by Christina Wen and Sean Gaffney, both recent transplants from New York, and by Rebecca Van Beek, a first-time visitor to Los Angeles, originally from South Africa. This is an excerpt from Rebecca's reflection. Quote, "This trip to LA was my first time in the US. It had so much bearing over my understanding of other cities in the US and the world, rather than the other way around. I feel like the US, even though the city is big and diverse, has influenced my perspective of the culture in general. I love the everyday aspect of architecture, so I really appreciated being shown these everyday lived-in spaces. It was green and gorgeous. Architecture I'd mostly never heard of in parts of the city I'd mostly never been. It was a very diverse day, and I enjoyed the selections that were varied in terms of typology, scale, and building, and period. Christina and Sean both noted the vastness and expansiveness of the city, with the weather being especially pleasant, which it was. And this was my third visit to the Pacific Design Center, but it wasn't until this time, and specifically focusing on green, that I noticed that the building doesn't touch the ground anywhere. So fittingly, blue was the first tour that I went on with Zach Chance, a Los Angeles West Sider for the past decade. It was the only tour where all transportation was a combination of walking and public transportation. So all of the other tours were done by car, but this one also covered the least distance in its single exploration. Starting off in downtown at the 1930s mixed-use Eastern Columbia, we admired the gold leaf that at the time cost 25 grand to install. Just a few blocks away, the Art Deco Los Angeles Jewelry Center's original elevator doors remain intact. We peered through the windows trying to take a look. It was then onto the Red Line at Pershing Square to head over to Zach's favorite venue, the Wiltern, for a closer and slower look during the daytime. Our first and only navigation bump happened during a bus transfer after leaving the Wiltern, but I came to expect that we'd get lost at least once during one of each exploration or make a wrong turn or two. 10 walking blocks were built in down Pico through the neighborhood of Arlington Heights. This was Zach's first time in the neighborhood, so we popped into shops along the way. A neighborhood that felt like a similar Los Angeles to me, but noted by Zach that it was in starker contrast to his routine Venice. Next was lunch at La Cevicheria, which I'd highly recommend if you're ever near Arlington Heights or in the mood for ceviche. The owner, while taking our order, excitedly noted that we must be there because of reading about their multiple mentions in the LA Times for being one of the top ceviche places in the city. But it just seemed easier for us to say yes than try to explain that we were eating there because the building was blue. Is my first time eating Guatemalan ceviche. It was then back on the bus to head for what I'd been waiting for, the Pacific Design Center's 1975 portion that was blue of the building. It was a Sunday, so we were unable to enter, and we checked to be able to check out any of the showrooms. So we walked around the full length of the exterior, only encountering security guards. To our surprise, the mocha at the Pacific Design Center was open, showing for the first time Catherine Opie's 700 Beam Road. These photographs of Elizabeth Taylor's home were taken months before and after her death. One of my favorite moments of the day was having time to take in the detail of all of these pieces. Then it was on the bus again to what ended up being Zach's favorite, the Church of Scientology on Sunset, designed in 1928 by Claude Bielman, originally as a hospital. We checked out the visitor center, watched a few informational videos, and were gifted a DVD. As we walked down the brick-side street, which ended with a few more blue Church of Scientology-owned buildings across from the main one, a security guard kindly noted that since we were tourists, we'd probably like to know that Marilyn Monroe had once been a patient in the building when it was Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and had walked out of the door that we were currently looking at. We thanked him and continued on to catch our last bus. Our day ended a little bit west of MacArthur Park at the electronics store Chung's. I don't know much about it, but it's always caught my attention when driving down 7th, and just always been a building that I find really fun. The 16 tours explored over 100 stops. After the tours were completed, I wanted to see how I did with guideline number 3, a variety of functional typologies. So you can see on the left-hand side that the least visited were factories and gas stations, with the most being restaurants, which were required for each tour, followed by retail and mixed use. These 100 buildings represent a very small percentage of the almost 3 million buildings in Los Angeles. My selections were personal. not intended to be a data analysis of our city's history with color in the built environment. I've started to have more questions about popularity of colors during different time periods, trends in material, zoning requirements, and repainting. These are all of the buildings that had some mention of color in the name or their main signage. And so pink, even though it looks purple, was actually the one that people seem to like to display more, that their building is pink and their name is pink. And so this is where the distribution of guideline number 4, including a variety of years built, what it looks like. I had a good amount of variety from not keeping track during my planning process. And I learned that unintentionally, I did not gravitate to buildings in the 90s. The orange tour and ribbon covered the longest time period, with purple covering the least. And while considering materiality, silver was the only one that did not use paint to achieve its color, which understandably building paint is not the way to go to achieve a reflective surface. But also I noted that these buildings were constructed starting in the 60s and onward, and was wondering about the relationship to design and construction technology of the times. As is part of LA and in any city's history, buildings are not going to be around forever. Some of the stops in the tour were chosen because I knew they were set for demolition, as was the case of the Hollywood Park Casino and the 6th Street Viaduct. Others, like Wacky Wacko and Chung's, I discovered later on that they'd transformed into their next iteration. These normal changes in rhythm of the city locked the ribbons into the time when they were captured. The ribbons and their companion maps are intended to be viewed in person. The 9-foot-long ribbons can stand alone, but ideally connect into reconfigurations of longer artificial constructs of Los Angeles. In person, when viewed at varying distances, different information becomes present. From afar, a viewer sees the entire elevation. On closer inspection, building details start to emerge. Within an arm's length, the text noting route, building information, and reflection about the tour are legible. With color as the catalyst, 16 explorations took place between 2016 to 2019. The 16 resulting ribbons, when viewed in person, will span over 130 feet, a frozen moment in time of the recoding and remixing. While wearing attire related to the tour color was highly encouraged, the only documentation of this was in building reflections. Also missing in documentation are the 2 playlists that Ashley Ponson curated for the Black and Brown tour. Over the years, on my routine and slightly less routine drives, I've used color navigation as a way to be more present and meditative during these drives. I'm always on the lookout for buildings that would be good to include on a new tour, and it's also just nice to notice something in closer detail that I might not have otherwise. So I'm going to end today with Victor Lorenzo's thoughts about the white tour that he went on. So the color tour experience was really fun. I think that's actually a more unique and profound attribute than it sounds. Unlike other styles of urban tours that assign meaning through the histories and events that took place on location and extend the significance of those to the overall context in an abstract way, there was something refreshing about the color tour, where the objective is tangibly right in front of your eyes. You got a cool history of the place, and you were, of course, but without the burden of trying to weave it all together into an overcooked narrative that seems to recreate the process by which the city came to be. You can actually just have fun and learn a bit about some of the sometimes iconic, sometimes off the beaten path stock that actually make the built environment in LA unique. It's the sort of architecture tour equivalent of another LA favorite of mine, the Passage Ride Situationist bike rides. More of a somewhat intentional wander through the unintended patterns of the city than a rigid narrative, refreshing and fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. So we do have time for some Q&A. So I hope that you all enjoyed the presentation and have some questions that you'd like to put forth. Please put them in the chat And we'll pose those to Ashley. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, Ashley, why don't you tell us what your goals are with this project as kind of your next steps?
Great question. So my next steps are to figure out where to show this project in physical space. So that's really how it was intended when I was designing and creating it, to be seen in person. So it's really figuring out where this project might be seen.
So stay tuned, everyone, for the physical manifestation. I see a question here. How were your participants selected?
So it was through what I thought would be friends that would enjoy the day. So ranging from ones that have design backgrounds to non-design backgrounds that also ranged from living in Los Angeles for a long time to ones that you saw in the presentation. So it's really just from my personal network of friends that I've known throughout the years.
So related to that, which tour would you take Kate Grantham on?
I think that, Kate, whichever color you choose as your favorite, you would have yours designed to you. But I think you would have liked the yellow or probably blue as well.
All right, we see some ideas coming in through the chat. I have a question for you, Ashley. What's something that was most unexpected that you learned through this process?
So, and I probably already knew this going in, but just really unexpected history behind building that, of course, we experience every day. I know one that was most surprising to me was Jewel Catch One, which I'd driven by forever, but didn't realize its place in history within the city. So it was really getting to know more closely just what all of these places mean within the city. Since, again, there's just so much here and around us every day that can get lost when we're focused on what our normal goings to and from are.
All right, so question about the multicolor spaces. Did you find any that were special patterns like Paisley or tartan, or how was the multicolor manifested?
Oh, so multicolor, that one was also a bit more environmental than some of the other ones. So that one included the Piñata district and the flower district, and also a lot of murals. So thinking about interior and exterior spaces with that one, and also Watts Towers. So this was also one where it felt a bit more patterned than the other colored tours. But no Paisley, that would have been fun if that was the main pattern that emerged.
Design idea for future building projects, perhaps. So I think we have time for one more question. Has your view of LA changed through doing this project?
Yes, definitely. I have unintended, but also intended, since I went there, connections to, again, neighborhoods that I don't otherwise think I would have gone to. So it was also a challenge in just getting through this massive space that we have in a kind of relatively short amount of time. So I do think I have a better personal spatial understanding of the city, and I've always, for whatever reason, tried to challenge myself to get around the city without using Google Maps or MapQuest. So I really like to navigate in that way. So it's helped with my own internal navigation of Los Angeles and how to get around the city.
All right, thank you, Ashley. And To recap, in case you're not able to be watching the chat, some folks have some thoughts. It would be awesome to get an app or maybe a shared Google map or your own version of a map of the stars that focused on color. So thank you again for sharing your excellent work with us today. And thank you all for joining for this portion of the symposium. As always, we appreciate your ongoing support and look forward to seeing you at our December fundraising event. So please do keep in mind AWAF as you're planning donations and think about funding our future winners. So I'll turn it back over, I believe, to Audrey to introduce the third conversation.
Thank you so much. Thanks AWAF, and thank you, Ashley. I really love thinking about exploring the city in a new way through the lens of color. I'm Audrey Sato, AWA+D parliamentarian, and I'm here to introduce Sarah Lorenzen and Madeline Campbell, who will be talking about their experiences starting and leading student and professional organizations. Sarah Lorenzen is a principal at Tolo Architecture, as well as a professor and former chair of the architecture department at Cal Poly Pomona. She is also chair of the AIA-LA Go Committee, which stands for Government Outreach. Maddie Campbell is a designer at KAA Design Group and was the founder and president of the Student Association for Women in Architecture when she studied for her Master's of Architecture at USC. So now I'll leave it to them to take it away.
Great. And Sarah, why don't you start us off with your personal introduction?
Audrey already said everything I was going to say. Thank you, Audrey.
You're awesome.
I would just add that I grew up in Mexico City, and I came to the US at 18 to go to college. And I started out in art as a drawing major before I switched to architecture school. And I actually went to architecture school twice, which was actually interesting. For some reason, I decided it was a good idea to have two masters. It's not really that it was about gaining more credentials. It was just really interesting because I went to architecture school at Georgia Tech, got an MArch 1 in the 90s. And there was sort of the tail end of postmodernism. And then I worked for about 7 years, and then I took a sabbatical for a year and went to SciArc. And the two educational experiences couldn't have been more different. And it actually was really interesting and kind of allowing me to see kind of how broad architectural education can be. So that's it.
Madeline, why don't you tell us about your background?
Yeah, hi guys. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to speak with Sarah and talk to all of you guys. Audrey did a great job presenting, but my background is I am the founder of the Student Association of Women in Architecture at USC, which is a pretty new organization. We began in 2019, so just a few years ago while I was completing my master's in architecture there. Now I finished up my master's in the spring of 2020, and I've been working as a designer at KA, as Audrey mentioned. But like Sarah, my background is a little bit mixed. I haven't always been in architecture. My undergrad education was in business, and I also had a studio art minor. And so those two things kind of led me to architecture eventually. But it is interesting having an education that's different than architecture when you come into an architecture education. Definitely business and architecture are two different fields. So yeah, but a little bit more, I guess, about SAWA. That's what we call the Student Association of Women in Architecture. It's an organization really aimed at having a space for women to come together and not only speak together about students' issues, but work with faculty, work with professional women in the field, and just have that outlet to have the inspiration to, you know, become great participants in the career, but also, you know, have that space to progress the education we're receiving. So yeah, there's a lot of different aspects to the organization, and I'm excited to talk to you guys a little bit more about it today.
Great. I'm going to start off the conversation with a question and just let it roll. You know, our topic today is design is political. And you both bring a very specific lens to this conversation. And could you talk about an anecdote of a college event that had a political component?
I guess I'll start and then I'll let Maddie go. I had when I was started school, I started at a women's college, Smith College in Massachusetts, which is a very kind of heavily feminist school. And one of the things that they had, which I thought was fantastic, they had once a year, they had this event called Rally Day. And it was really meant to rally the troops. And it was a kind of overtly political college-wide event. And they would bring in these kind of phenomenal, fiery women to kind of rally everybody up. And, you know, I went to one with Gloria Steinem and one with Molly Yard, who, for people that are younger, was kind of very famous head of the National Organization of Women. And after that, they would like set up kind of ways to get everybody involved after they got everybody all fired up. And in the late 80s, there was actually, as there is now, this political move to ban abortions. And so they actually had buses lined up for us all to go down to DC, and we went there to rally in support of abortion rights for all women. And so I actually thought that was a really interesting part of the educational experience, which I don't see very much anywhere else.
Yeah, that's a really incredible experience and sounds really inspiring and fun to get riled up as a group. We at USC, we had a somewhat similar event. I mean, it wasn't quite as politically motivated, but it just, you know, as the conversation around women is becoming more and more important. For International Women's Day a few years ago, the faculty really gathered together to put on an event throughout the School of Architecture, where they printed out little masks of famous and like just well-known women architects throughout history, because a lot of the time in our education, I feel like we miss out on learning about women in architecture. And so they put them all over the school, and the entire school came out and kind of gathered together and had their women in architecture mask ahead to share, which was really fun and a fun way to get everybody involved and thinking about women in architecture. And our faculty were included as well. So it was fun to, you know, walk around and talk to your fellow students and ask them who their person was. And this event was kind of in collaboration with a wiki-thon where people participated to add women in architecture to Wikipedia and have pages for them so that the information about women in architecture was really available. So it was kind of a fun event with more playful aspect paired with something that's a little bit more goal-oriented at creating, you know, some recognition for women. And this was actually prior to us starting our organization and was really an inspiring event to me. Looking at the way that the faculty gathered it together and seeing student participation and interest led me to kind of want to create a space to continue to do those types of events.
Yeah, so what was that? So was that really what was part of the motivation to start? And once you kind of decided that, what did that look like? How did you get everybody involved and launch a new group?
Yeah, I think that that was a motivation. It was something that was in the back of my mind as I was in the School of Architecture. There's quite a few women students, and it's a presence, but it's still not something that's actively being discussed, and there wasn't really a space. And that was something that I was thinking about and looking for. And I was actually listening a lot to a podcast called the Design Voice Podcast, which is a pretty fun podcast. If you don't listen to it, I definitely recommend it, where they interview women who are involved in the built environment, not just architects. But that podcast, I was inspired and really wanted to see the opportunity to have women who spoke like that on the show come and speak to students and have that environment at USC. And the event that I just spoke about, I mean, that happened kind of right in accordance when I was listening to this podcast and thinking about the events. And I was just thinking, okay, well, like people are starting to do it. There's an interest. I want this, and seeing people, excuse me, seeing people want to be involved. I was like, okay, well, there's an opportunity for this because people want to see it happen just from the amount of involvement that was going on in our school already.
And what were like some of the challenges you faced or when you were doing this?
Yeah, I mean, starting an organization, which I'm sure you know as well, there's a political aspect to it, and especially when you're in a giant university, it's not as easy as just saying, oh, look, like, you know, everyone's really interested, people are riled up, we can just kind of rally together. There is some logistics of defining yourself in a way that the university accepts you to define, and going through the specific organizations that you need to register with. So it is a little bit of a process, but just looking for the guidance of our faculty and asking for the mentorship, and then going through the process that there is. I mean, did you have to also kind of navigate a logistical system that makes starting these organizations a little bit more of a challenge than just the inspiration and like the want to do it? There's a little bit more of there's a back end that makes it a little bit more difficult sometimes.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I've started an organization. I've always been kind of joined organizations that are already well kind of established or underway. So I get that you've the sort of desire to start something from scratch requires a little bit more work. So what were some of the successes that you had?
I mean, it was just really great to get the group to see to see the response once we were, put up a few flyers, said that this was happening. To see the amount of student interest was really a positive and inspiring part of starting the organization. Otherwise, I think while I was in leadership, I mean, we put on a panel of women architects, which was really well received and really inspiring, and learning more about their personal journeys was probably the thing that I was most proud of. But as it's continued, I think the organization has really done an incredible job partnering with the other student groups and looking for ways to not just represent women at USC, but work together with our other organizations to kind of push a full comprehensive diversity initiative. And that has been a huge success that I'm really proud to see them continuing.
I have a question, and this might be a little bit more for Sarah a little bit, but I think it'll hit both of you. So Maddie, you were starting to get into the diversity and starting to talk about, how do you then network and social network and start to expand influence and reach. And Sarah, I know you've in the past talked about jury selection for your final crit. And I'm going to point to Sarah at least first. Jury selection it has politics in that. And I'd like to hear a little bit about that and kind of hear about some of the challenges you both have experienced within what is a very structured environment in academia. Academia is super structured. So how do you navigate that? But first I'm going to start with Sherry.
Okay, yeah. The jury process is one that I have actually always been kind of interested in. In terms of how do you get, it's something that we often talk about faculty members in terms of kind of getting better representation, obviously not just in the faculty, which is really critical given that students are more and more diverse. The faculty should obviously reflect the diversity of the student body, but that has some challenges for long-term faculty just because of the way the tenure track process works, and also the way that lecturers, have become, lecturers are more diverse, but they're also significantly underpaid. And that really kind of creates problems with equity and diversity, given that it's very hard to kind of live off of a faculty lecturer salary. And that has to change if we want greater representation. But in terms of the juries, yeah, often you go and that's, the people judging your last project or your end of term project or your midterm, and sort of being really careful about making sure that the people that are giving feedback to students come from a wide variety of backgrounds and kind of can talk to what the students, and maybe more adequately address some of the students' own concerns and ideas. I don't know if Andrea's still here, but a while ago, she asked me to write a piece for the LA Forum's newsletter on education. And I wrote a kind of, I don't know, I suppose it was a little bit snarky op-ed about the jury process. And I actually have it here. I'll read you this one little paragraph. It says, in much of architectural education, our courses, particularly the jury process, is largely about establishing what constitutes good taste, which for the most part is the taste of the ruling class. Often as critics, our authority as tastemakers established through our choice of clothing, our use of obscure references, what the philosopher Bordeaux calls gratuitous knowledge, our use of jargon, and most importantly, our visceral intolerance to the taste of others. And having just come out of the jury process for our senior project, I would say that that's something that we all need to improve on, is really making sure that the kinds of interests the students show are addressed and that their concerns are addressed directly, instead of it being a judgment about the kind of grand narrative that comes out of architectural education.
Maddie, did you have any thoughts about, working within the infrastructure of academia and challenges you had there, and then how you bring that into your professional life post school?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think, excuse me, there's a little frog in my throat. I think that, looking for those opportunities in school, I felt like they were a little bit less represented in school than they seem to be in the profession. I mean, we have fantastic organizations like AWA+D and WIA, the Women in Architecture part of AIA. So seeing that those national organizations existed was a positive for me when I looked forward to entering the full career. But I feel like it is still a little lacking in education. I mean, that was a huge motivation for when I started it, I was looking to see if there was even a national organization, and we just didn't have it at USC, but there isn't one. There is not a student association for women in architecture nationally. I mean, a few schools have organizations like that, but it isn't really something that we see across the board that's unifying, that would be able to make it so that students from different programs could communicate. And I think that that aspect would be really positive to see if maybe one of our professional organizations could kind of try and help mentor a student branch. How I've actually personally done that, I can't really speak to having done something that lofty of a goal quite yet, but I mean, I'm just looking for opportunities to continue to participate and to continue to connect the two, the career and the education, because I do feel like they are a little bit disjointed.
I can totally see that. And so Sarah, I'm going to connect two dots here. How is your experience similar to Maddie's? How does it compare to when you were in college to what you see now and what you hear through Maddie's story?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what she's talking about is not, I mean, it's definitely improved, and there's certainly a kind of a desire to kind of, I do think that generally the schools are all kind of reckoning with this lack of diversity in faculty, and kind of how to better address, non-Western architecture, and sort of make the education more inclusive and broader, and really have many more perspectives. So, and I think, but it is surprising that, like she said, that she went there and expecting to find something and had to create it, when actually in most schools now, women represent about 50% of the student body in architecture schools, which is very different than even, actually when I was in school, it was probably the student body was also about 50% in the grad programs I was in. But in 3 years that I was at Georgia Tech, for example, I only had one woman instructor who's our architectural history professor out of, dozens and dozens of classes. So certainly I do think it's changing, but maybe not fast enough.
So then I'm going to ask one question to close us out on this conversation, and it's to both of you. And I want to look to the next. And so if you had one thing you think could make effective change now, what would that be? I'm throwing you a curveball, by the way.
I think that something that is important to me, and I'm not sure exactly how it would be accomplished, but like Sarah just mentioned, I mean, so much of when people, the student body in architecture, are women, and it has been that way in higher education for a while, and we know this, but we're still not seeing the representation in the field. And I think that that's really like the most important, is how do we accomplish from education, finishing that education and becoming licensed and practicing, like what is the thing that's not motivating women, or not making it really a difficulty for women to continue to practice and to continue to use that education that so many people are getting. So how do we accomplish that? How do we make it easier? I'm not quite sure, but I think that it needs to be like a number one topic of discussion.
Yeah, it's a hard question. And I think a lot of people are, what Maddie brought up, a lot of people leaving the profession for many different reasons. And, I was talking about women in academia and the difficulties of having such, poorly paid lecturers. And I think that is one way of changing it, is kind of improving pay and improving resources for lecturers in school, since they make up, more than half of the faculty at most universities, sometimes 3/4 of the faculty. And then just more generally in the profession, I mean, I think having more women involved, obviously AWA is like a huge part of that, mentorship and kind of keeping people and finding opportunities, but then also just, doing, social ways of kind of creating social groups. Everybody's familiar with the men's smoking lounge and the golf tournaments and all of that were kind of social opportunities that allowed people to kind of meet and do business informally and also kind of support each other. There's also the kind of amplification tactic, which is, let's say, Anna, I won this award, and I go and I post it on Facebook, and then somebody else does. And there's a way of kind of bouncing, pushing women to become more visible by amplifying their work, by continuously replaying it. It's also obviously what Audrey does with her podcast, to really kind of bring forward the voices of all of these women and sort of showcasing what their work is. So I think that the methods of amplifying what we all do and having a support structure and, getting on boards and then getting other people on those boards and making sure that people are visible. And I think all of those, there's not a singular tactic. It's many, many tactics, but increasing, I think that also would help. Up, right, a timer.
That's perfect timing, and thank you both so much for sharing your experiences from a very different point of view. I think that's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And do we have, Meg, did we have any Q&A or?
Lise, you managed to weave the question into your questions.
Sorry.
No, that was perfect. So what we're going to do now is break out into breakout rooms so we can all have our own conversations. So we hope that everybody will stick around for that. We are going to break into these rooms randomly. Each room does have an AWA+D or presenter leader, and we'll be in these breakout rooms for about 15 or 20 minutes. And then we'll just come back to the main room, say our goodbyes, and go on about our Friday afternoon.
So welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a productive breakout discussion. This actually concludes our today's programming and our two-day symposium. I would like to thank everyone for coming, and thank you to our speakers. Let's unmute and thank them.
Yes, thank you.
I would also like to thank our board members as well as our symposium committee members for advising and helping us put together these wonderful 2 days. And of course, our fearless leader, Meg Coffey, who's been working tirelessly for these events. Although the symposium is over, there's more where this came from. Please join to become a member. As you know, we're celebrating our 100th year anniversary next year, and there will be a lot of good programming coming up. And with that, I hope to see you at our next event. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.